Hello, everyone. For those of you in the back, there is an invitation to come and sit closer. For those of you who don't know me, we started a few minutes late just in case there were some people who are having a hard time finding this room. My name is Anna Hoofnagels, and I'm an associate professor of music at Carleton University, and this has been such an honor to be able to organize this roundtable in honor of, for many of us, a very important mentor, and also a huge figure in Canadian music research, Indigenous music research, music and gender, media studies. You're going to hear all about the legacy of Beverley Diamond and the impact she's had on many of us. So we're going to start. There's a number of us, obviously, who are going to present, and we all have some prepared text, but we do really want to emphasize this is about Beverley Diamond and her contributions and the way that she's shaped ethnomusicology and music studies in Canada. So I have a little slide presentation. So she is the Society for American Music's honorary member for this year, so we'll have the whole weekend to celebrate her. So this year's naming of Dr. Beverley Diamond as the Society for American Music's honorary member for 2017 is an accolade that recognizes her significant contribution to music scholarship in North America and the impact she has had on her students and contemporaries. This roundtable is comprised of colleagues and former students of Dr. Diamond who, through their presentations, will attest to her impact in the disciplines of ethnomusicology, music in Canada, gender and music studies, and Indigenous music studies, among others. Diamond's influence is felt in academic societies, university programs, and public institutions, and through her mentoring of many students over 30 years, her impact continues to resonate and grow. I would like to start this roundtable with some background information on Bev's career. An impossible task. What I will do here is to highlight a few key areas where she has been most impactful. Through long-term academic appointments at Queen's University, York University, and Memorial University of Newfoundland, in addition to positions at the University of Toronto, Harvard, and McGill Universities, Bev has shaped the discourse about music in Canada and ethnomusicology through her teaching, mentoring of students, and research. The subject that she researched was, and continues to be, quite extensive, ranging from music heard at the national events of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to negotiations for Indigenous artists in recording studios, women musicians in Newfoundland and Labrador, and the oral history and cataloging of the music of her late husband, composer Clifford Crawley. As Connie Zegel will discuss, Bev's influence wasn't merely in the subject matter with which she engaged, but also the approaches she took and the questions she asked. A few of her key publications remain canonical in studies of music in Canada and Indigenous music, including Visions of Sound. She co-wrote with Sam Cronk and Francisca von Rosen, and Native American music in Eastern North America. In addition to a number of guest editorships of learned journals, and probably hundreds of journal articles and encyclopedia entries on a wide range of topics, she also co-edited numerous volumes, including Canadian Music, Issues of Hegemony and Identity, which she co-edited with Robert Whitmer, Music and Gender, which she co-edited with Pierre Courmoisla, Post-Colonial Distances, the study of popular music in Canada and Australia, co-edited with Dennis Crowdy and Dan Downs, and my favorite, Aboriginal Music in Contemporary Canada, Echoes and Exchanges, which she co-edited with me. It was a real pleasure and honor to do that work with her. In addition to her impressive publishing record is her other role as mentor, organizer, facilitator, and enabler, serving as a regular Juno Award judge, an examiner of theses and dissertations, appraiser of manuscripts, grant proposals, graduate programs, undergraduate programs, conference and symposium organizer, and she's been a member on numerous editorial boards. Her leadership extends beyond the university, of course, as she has been an active member in a number of academic societies, where she has served as president, most recently as SEM, board member on ICTM and CSTM, and conference organizer and keynote speaker. But perhaps her greatest impact has been on shaping the next generations of ethnomusicologists and music scholars in Canada. Bev has supervised an impressive number of students, many of whom have gone on to successful careers themselves. And here are some stats. Who doesn't love the details? 25 former supervisees now hold university positions. 3 are currently postdocs, 3 are Canada Research Chairs. There's some of whom she's lost track of, but we're convinced they're doing good work because you have to if you've been even slightly touched by Bev. 3 have performance composition careers, 12 are working in public sector jobs, including arts management, museum curation, 6 are school teachers, 3 of her recent MA supervisors are currently PhD students, and she still has 3 PhD supervisees on the go. So as you can tell just from these numbers, she's been hugely impactful. Finally, just to assure members of the Society for American Music that bestowing an honorary membership on Beverley Diamond is the right thing to do, a quick summary of some of the titles and honors that she's already received. So this is obviously the most recent one. She received a Professor Emeritus designation from Memorial University in May of 2016, honorary lifetime membership at Canadian Society for Traditional Music, Shirt Gold Medal Award, Queen's Jubilee Medal, a member of the Order of Canada, a SOCAN Foundation Coombs Award of Excellence for Advancement of Research in Canadian Music. She was a Trudeau Fellow. She received an honorary lifetime membership at the Canadian University Music Society, and she was elected to the Royal Society of Canada. This is just a sample of things. This is clearly not comprehensive. These honorifics all attest the impact that Bev has had in many domains around the study of music in Canada, Indigenous music, music and gender, recording studios, questions around identity, narratives, power relations, and their impact on music making. More important is the support, encouraging, and mentoring that she has given so selflessly for decades. Selflessly, thank you, Judith, for that edit. Selfless. She has built a community of scholars, a network of allies across Canada and around the world, whether it is at the Music and Gender Study Group meeting in Bern, Switzerland, or the massive annual meetings of the Society for Ethnomusicology. Bev's impact is felt by everyone in her presence through her thoughtful questioning of ideas and her gentle nudging to help us along in our own work. So our next presenter is Dr. Robin Elliott from the University of Toronto, and I'm going to give you a little bit of bio of each of these people before they speak to Bev and the rest of you. So Robin Elliott holds the Jean A. Chalmers Chair in Canadian Music at the University of Toronto. With Gordon Smith, he co-edited Music Traditions, Cultures, and Contexts, a feshrift for Beverley Diamond that was published in 2010.
Thank you. First thing I would like to emphasize about Bev's contribution to Canadian music scholarship is its sterling quality. Every single one of her publications is full of brilliant insights, novel interpretations, and deftly applied critical theory. There are very few music scholars who have worked so consistently and at such high quality throughout the course of their entire career. She simply does not publish unless she has something important to say. And not just in her books and major essays. Her copious reviews and encyclopedia articles are of a similarly high standard. In her hands, a review becomes an invigorating scholarly debate, and an encyclopedia article, a magisterial synthesis of vast amounts of information. I'm thinking, for instance, of her article on Inuit music for the New Grove Dictionary of American Music, or the superb overview of ethnomusicology in Canada that she wrote for the second edition of the Encyclopedia of Music in Canada with James Robbins. I'm also struck by how she always prods us to do better. She has encouraged ethnomusicologists to pay more attention to history and music historians to pay more attention to social processes. She has urged us all to be aware of the need to expand the social, intellectual, and interdisciplinary perspectives that we bring to bear on our own consideration of the multiple and complex roles that music plays in our lives. In my brief remarks, I would like to comment in detail on one article that was of particular inspiration for me, and touch quickly on 2 others, the second of which will lead to some concluding thoughts about future directions for Canadian music scholarship. I begin with a paper that Bev delivered to the Society for American Music 27 years ago when the conference was held in Toronto. The presenter before Bev went way over his allocated time, as conference speakers sometimes do. As I recall it, this left about 10 minutes for Bev to deliver her 30-minute paper. She gamely raced through her slides and gave a sort of improvised précis of her paper on the fly, reducing her argument to its bare essentials. It was under these less than ideal conditions that I first heard one of the most important essays on Canadian music historiography. An earlier version of the paper had been given in 1989 during the Canadian University Music Society meeting at Laval University, on which occasion it was titled Narratives in Canadian Music History. For the Sonic meeting, the content of the paper had been expanded to include reflections on narratives in US music history textbooks as well, and the title was changed to Reflections on Teaching North American Music History, a Canadian Perspective. The essay was published twice, first in the fine collection of essays, which, as Anna said, Bev edited with Robert Whitmer in 1994, Canadian Music Issues of Hegemony and Identity, and then in Taking a Stand, the Festschrift in honor of John Beckwith, one of her former mentors at the University of Toronto, that appeared in 1995. With this essay, and also with the Hegemony and Identity collection in which it first appeared, Bev effected a significant transformation of the field of Canadian music studies, and indeed of the very phrase Canadian music itself. To appreciate the impact of her article, let's consider what was previously meant by the phrase Canadian music. In much earlier scholarship, and to an extent in general public usage as well, the phrase referred primarily, if not exclusively, to works written in Western art music traditions by composers based in Canada. This usage of the term was especially prevalent in Toronto, and vigorously promoted by the composer John Weinsweig and his colleagues and students. In 1959, a library and information centre was opened in Toronto to preserve and promote the creative work of the members of the Canadian League of Composers, and it was confidently and unapologetically titled the Canadian Music Centre. This was not a surprising development, perhaps, in a city whose local arts groups bear names such as the Canadian Opera Company, the National Ballet of Canada, and the Canadian Stage Company. A bit later on, the CBC produced a recorded anthology of Canadian music, and later still, the Canadian Musical Heritage Society produced 25 volumes of Canadian music, all dedicated exclusively to the work of our composers. The Montreal composer Jean Papineau-Couture asserted in 1991 that, quote, Canadian music is any music composed by a Canadian, unquote, thus omitting from his definition orally transmitted, improvised, and other types of non-notated musical cultures. Such a view allowed that there were certainly lots of music in Canada, as the Encyclopedia of Music in Canada demonstrated conclusively when it first appeared in 1981, but only the Canadian League of Composers was creating Canadian music. In retrospect, it was a bold move to position a marginal and rather limited repertoire of works that was heavily indebted to European models and influences as the only repertoire with a legitimate claim to the title Canadian music. The composers were able to maintain their grip on that term for the better part of a generation is testament either to their sheer persuasiveness and hegemonic position in Canada's cultural life, or else to the studied indifference of their fellow musicians and the world at large. Or maybe, in typical Canadian fashion, it was thanks to a kind of muddled combination of those factors. This was the world into which Beverley Diamond launched her essay on narratives in Canadian music history. In it, she analyzes Canadian music history textbooks by Helmut Coleman, Clifford Ford, and Timothy McGee in ways that had never been attempted before. Prior to Bev's article, the primary agenda of Canadian music scholarship on the whole had been to preserve and promote, to locate and catalogue, and to craft a basic historical narrative. Guided explicitly in the case of Coleman and implicitly for Ford and McGee by the positivist historical agenda of the 19th century German historian Leopold von Ranke, these three textbooks attempted to set forth Canada's musical past wie es eigentlich gewesen, as it actually happened. Bev brought to her analysis of this literature an impressive arsenal of contemporary critical theory to take a good hard look at the ideas and interpretive strategies employed by Canadian music historians up to 1990. She drew attention to the underlying assumptions implicit in those three textbooks: the overly simplistic narratives of progress, the privileging of composition over other kinds of musical activities, the marginalization or omission of huge swaths of repertoire, the isolation of Indigenous music from the chronological sweep of the narrative, These are some of the telling observations she made on how Canadian music history had been conceptualized in general and specifically represented in these three textbooks. In the final section of the essay, she draws comparisons with US textbooks and finds some crucial differences. Canadians favor a more rigid chronological framework, pay less attention to popular music forms, and privilege urban over rural music making more than Americans do. The article was a revelation for me, not so much for its content, invigorating and provocative though that certainly was, but more as a wake-up call to the fact that we need to think more critically about what we as Canadian music scholars do and how we do it. We need to be aware of and draw upon diverse intellectual perspectives and bring sharpened critical sensitivities to the practice of both writing and reading about Canadian music. Perhaps most crucially of all, the article urged us to move from the notion of Canadian music as an object or a text to be studied and described to Canadian music as a social process to be investigated from every possible angle. Skipping ahead to the year 2000, Bev provided another decisive intervention in Canadian music historiography with the article, What's the Difference? Reflections on Discourses of Morality, Modernism, and Mosaics in the Study of Music in Canada. Here, Bev uses the fields of tension idea that was developed by Christer Malm and his Swedish colleagues, which holds that conflicting tendencies can arise simultaneously in musical worlds. For example, the conflict between the local and global perspectives, between homogeneity and diversity, and between the individual and the collective. Bev uses this model to reassess several historical periods of Canadian music scholarship, from the late 19th century to the very recent past, before offering some suggestions for future research directions. Among the many things this article accomplished was the rehabilitation of the reputations of Helen Creighton and John Murray Gibbon, both of whom had recently come in for sharp criticism in the work of the Marxist historian Ian MacKay. Even more daringly, the article implicates ethnomusicology of the 1970s and 1980s as a perhaps unwitting agent in the state project of multiculturalism, which swept real problems of racism, sexism, and imbalances of power in Canada under the scholarly rug. Bev called for a more radical scholarly praxis that would promote the relationship between music and social justice. The last article that I will consider here brings this praxis to the forefront. Native American Ways of brackets music history appeared in the Cambridge History of World Music, edited by Philip Bowman in 2013. The article poses a fascinating question. Indeed, I would say the single most important question for Canadian music scholars to ponder for the future. Namely, is it possible for us to reconcile Indigenous and European concepts of time, memory, and history? Bev notes that working with print, as most of us primarily do, constrains the scope of what is thinkable in terms of writing about music and expressive culture. Can our logocentrism be complemented by a wider array of information-sharing media to embrace multiple perspectives on Indigenous music and indeed on all types of Canadian music? Can we develop equitable collaborative practices in both research and music making that work to address historical and contemporary imbalances of power? I would like to end by discussing briefly a young musician whose work seems to me to be searching for productive answers to these timely questions. Jeremy Dutcher is a classically trained operatic tenor who blends his Wallastock heritage with his creative activities as a performer and composer. His current project, titled Wallastokwiik Lintu Wakona, Our Maliseet Songs, he describes as, quote, part composition, part musical ethnography, and part linguistic reclamation, unquote. Jeremy takes as the starting point for this project archival recordings of Wallastock songs and stories that were made along the St. John River in New Brunswick in 1911 by William H. Mechling. These wax cylinder recordings are now in the collection of the Canadian Museum of History. In the performance of an excerpt from this project that I saw last month in Toronto, Jeremy sings in dialogue with these recordings, accompanying himself at the piano and illustrating the music with slide projections. It was moving to hear these historical recordings brought back to life, with new creative layers added on top as a commentary on, and indeed a critique of, the original recording project. There are only about 500 fluent speakers of Latuiwakon, the Wallastock language, remaining, And with this project, Jeremy hopes to make traditional songs more accessible and encourage other young Maliseet people to engage in their culture and language. He notes that Mechtling, the ethnographer who collected these recordings, remarked in 1913 that, quote, "The younger generations are not able to sing the Indian songs, so that in all probability the music of the Maliseet will die out with this generation," unquote. It is Jeremy's ambition to prove Mechtling wrong. Let it be our ambition as Canadian music scholars to do three things: to engage as creatively with the past as Jeremy does, to try in the present to live up to the scholarly standards that Bev has set for us by the example of her own work, and to work with her and others to forge in the future a body of knowledge about Canadian music and expressive culture that informs, inspires, and uplifts us all. Thanks.
Our next speaker on the program today is Kadi Sago, who's a professor of ethnomusicology at Memorial University of Newfoundland. A former student of Bev Diamond, Kadi is the general editor of the Yearbook for Traditional Music, and she's going to speak to us about theoretical models, innovations, and considerations. Thank you.
I remember one of the first articles I ever read by Beverley Diamond, the transmission of Algonquian Indian hymns between orality and literacy. Published in 1988, it was an exploration of mostly Innu hymnody through the lens of Walter Ong's theories of orality and literacy. Ong's work was de rigueur in the 80s, and Bev was hip to its currency. Poking at his conceptual categories, yet avoiding polemics, always avoiding polemics, she showed how Innu blended oral and written mnemonic modes, challenging the then common assumption that indigenous hymn singing was controlled exclusively by Euro-American missionaries. Of the 10 words in that article's title, I'll suggest that between is one of the most important. Certainly the most important for today's gathering. Between, a powerful preposition that connects both syntactically and semantically, is one I've come to associate with our friend and colleague. Rather inconspicuously, it evokes the relational processes on which Bev Diamond has pitched her intellectual tent over the past 40 years. Don't worry, this isn't going to be an exhaustive inventory of ideas upon which Bev's work has been drawn, upon which Bev's work has drawn. Her theoretical reach is far too broad and rich for that, but I will try to sketch some parameters of engagement which I've drawn from our recent conversations. When I asked Bev what guided her theoretical use, she immediately distanced herself from grand theory. Maybe, she said, because I'm quite committed to what the local can teach us, it's invariably going to be small. Small, perhaps, but when we talked about gender, the names of heavyweights rose to the surface. She leaned productively on Judith Butler's concept of performing gender. She also loved Butler's evocation of the body as having no inside and outside, of skin and tissue in seamless continuity with each other. Suzanne Cusick's courage to speak in the first person and to breach the male-female binary was transformative. Bev's conjunctive impulse also found sympathy with Susan McClary's notion of containment, how one element, such as an operatic character, is surrounded by other elements that cast it differently. In each conceptual instance, Bev admired the way that boundaries gave way to movement across and between phenomena, processes highlighted in her own work. The list of touchstones in the area of media and technology is again impossibly long, but Bev singled out Paul Théberge's sophisticated theorization of audio recording. She was animated by his rethinking of the sequential relationship between technological production and reception. Mediated musical production, Théberge pointed out, often depends on prior listening experience. Bev took his questions with her into the field. How can the perfection of studio recordings energize live performance? She asked her consultants. Rejecting technological determinism, Bev explored the ways that musicians weighed technological with performative, social, and cultural considerations. I'd like to defer the topical area of Indigenous studies to the next two parts of my presentation. Let me say, though, how Bev has been theoretically energized by her friendships with tradition bearers like Sadie Buck and Frodi Fjellheim, among many others. In the Academy, recent theorization by Audra Simpson, Peter Nabokov, Elizabeth Pomonelli, and Ana Maria Ochoa inform her most recent writing. This presentation's focus on theory begs a more fundamental question. What is it? It's a question that has dominated recent debates in Indigenous studies. In the introduction to their 2014 volume, Theorizing Native Studies, Audra Simpson and Andrea Smith urge consideration of the relationship of theory to practice in the pursuit of Indigenous intellectual sovereignty. They write that, quote, theory is not antagonistic to practice. If we understand theory more simply as an overall rationale for why we engage in the practices we engage in, then all practice is informed by a theoretical rationale, end quote. In characterizing the link between theory and practice, Bev is willing to go even further. In her 2000 article, Theory from Practice, First Nations Popular Music in Canada, her 2000 article, Theory from Practice, First Nations Popular Music in Canada, equates social theory with musical practice. By musical practice, she means not just acts of sounding, but in the case of this article, things like image selection and styles of acknowledgement that artists use in liner notes. She understands all such practices as fundamentally rooted in concepts of historical styles and relationship to the environment, including the global human community, to quote her directly. Practices, then, are not just informed by theory, nor are they just objects to which we apply theory. Bev concludes the article inviting her readers, quote, to recognize alternative critical theory in systems rooted in oral tradition or reliant on sensory data other than words. Ethnomusicologists are continually staking out new sites for ethnographic inquiry. In the late 1990s and 2000s, one of those sites was a recording studio, and Bev was there. Following her consultant's lead, she often focused less on sonic results and more on the social achievement of those results. It was in the studio she discovered that identity, ethnomusicologists' go-to concept for over a quarter century, had lost its edge. It was, as Bev told me, too easy to describe people's identities rather than to think about the broader issues that formed them. It's such a complex set of relationships in those spaces, and it completely does away with any sort of essentializing about ethnicity. As an alternative, she developed alliance studies, setting in motion her conviction that musical practice is theory. So just what is alliance studies? It's an inquiry-based model that shows how we might hear contemporary expressions of indigeneity in terms of alignments. What genres do musicians place their voices in? How does technological mediation, adding reverb, for example, inflect indigeneity? Bev notes how Indigenous musicians are under pressure to conform to what Van Toorn calls a patron discourse, a discourse that values unusual, exotic timbres and distinctive practices. Think Inuit throat singing. What does it mean, she asks, when Indigenous musicians choose mainstream styles instead? And how do they shape How do they shape meaning through language choice, through citation and collaboration? And what's the role of customary law when Indigenous music is commodified and put into global circulation? Like any theorist, Bev is compelled to revisit alliance whenever it's used anew. In response to the critique that the word alliance has too positive a cachet, she says, in fact, I liked alliance because it was both strategic and it could be used for a long or short period of time. You can be an ally for the purposes of getting something done. In these few minutes, I've tried to portray Bev as a dialogic user of other people's small theories. Her attraction to the work of feminist and media scholars reveals the importance Bev places on relationality and process. Bev has reflected deeply on what counts as theory. Clearly, her understanding of theory as practice is richly informed by decades of consultation with First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and Sami musicians. Their knowledge about how the world works and how it ought to work are embedded in their performative choices, sonic and otherwise. We only need to listen closely, Bev tells us. Finally, regarding the 4 domains she mapped out in the Alliance Studies model, Bev told me that you could map out another 25 areas. Here's hoping she does.
Thank you, Connie, for both Connie and Robin for very interesting and provocative reflections on Bev's impact. I want to take a few minutes to give those of you in the audience an opportunity to reflect on those 2 areas that we've so far covered. If there's some theoretical framework or some idea or some research that Bev has done that's been especially impactful that you wanted to comment on, we welcome feedback from you, because we're all engaged in the kinds of research and asking the kinds of questions that Bev's been a trailblazer for. So I think you can just use your outside voice. Or we can think about it. Then we have time for Q&A at the end as well, but we just want to make sure that you all feel that you also can contribute to the roundtable, because so many of us have been impacted by that. So as these words are washing over you, think about them, and we'll look forward to having more discussions after a few more presentations. So the next 2 presenters are Judith Clausen and Megan Forsyth. And they've set it up as a dialogue between the 2 of them, because they're both engaged in questions around models and practices for community engagement, and the way in which Bev has kind of empowered that and really made an effort to reach out to communities. So I'm going to start with some bios about these 2 fine people. Megan Forsyth is the project coordinator and researcher at the Research Center for the Study of Music, Media, and Place at Memorial University of Newfoundland, and the director of the Choral Center for Excellence in Choral Music. She teaches in ethnomusicology and popular music at Memorial. Judith Clausen is the curator for cultural expression at the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau, Quebec. She's given me a very short bio, but for those of you who know her, she does a lot of other stuff too. But I'm not going to go there. I could get too creative, so I'll pass it over to Beast.
Thank you. It's a really wonderful pleasure for us both, I think, to be here today. Our dialogue this afternoon will examine Bev's work within the context of community and public engagement, underscoring the fundamental place of collaboration in her approach and looking at some possibilities for future directions. Community engagement is an important thread that has been woven throughout Bev's work. Significantly, this engagement is not simply a set of keywords or a positive secondary fieldwork outcome. Rather, it grows from a basic approach that takes community goals and questions seriously, and that demonstrates an implicit respect for people in and outside of the immediate range of Bev's research. The establishment of Memorial University's Research Center for the Study of Music, Media, and Place, or MMAP, is one such example. MMAP was created in 2003 when Bev took on a Canada Research Chair position in ethnomusicology at Memorial University in St. John's, Newfoundland. Fundamentally linked to the research goals of Bev's CRC were MMAP initiatives that sought to create a space that mutually supported academic and community goals and outcomes. Not only does the center bring academics, musicians, and cultural activists into meaningful conversations with one another, it also serves as a space in which projects can be collectively shaped, bringing new questions into creative focus. By broadening the idea of what constitutes community, that is to say, by enabling students, scholars, musicians, and other cultural actors to talk to each other and to act in collaboration, it is not only dialogue and new questions that emerge as significant, but also tangible outcomes.
The Neighbors phone app is one such outcome. The Neighbors project builds on an earlier research project on cultural diversity in St. John's, begun in 2009 under the title St. John's Many Voices. Two teams of graduate students, a couple who I think are here today, interviewed and conducted archival research on the history of a wide range of immigrant communities in St. John's and nearby communities on the Avalon Peninsula. The resulting oral history archive contains interviews with over 90 individuals from diverse ethnic and religious communities, as well as manuscripts, photographs, videos, and new performance material. While the book project emanating from that initial work is underway, our conversation shifted to the desire for the project to have a broader impact and to refocus the research on several new themes of intellectual and social significance. In 2014, MMAP hosted a day-long meeting with cultural diversity stakeholders about the creation of one or more cultural diversity exhibitions. 40 representatives of culturally diverse communities, immigrant organizations, museum archive sectors, city and provincial government departments, exhibit designers, and academic colleagues from religious studies, political science, history, folklore, music, medicine, education, sociology, and linguistics were represented. The Harris Center, Memorial University's hub for public policy and regional development issues, as well as the university's Office of Public Engagement were also present. The meeting focused primarily on socially relevant issues, how to extend the visibility of diversity, and how to bridge generational differences. The following guidelines, general guidelines, were agreed upon. An exhibit should emphasize meeting, exchanging, and participating rather than observing or spectating. And the participants agreed on using the idea of neighbors as an overall framework. They felt the project should address questions of belonging, different kinds of cultural connections and alliances, including intergenerational, as well as ethnic diversity, and that they should emphasize lived culture, not displayed culture. The group supported the idea of creating public exhibits, both physical and virtual, in unexpected places that would be frequented by different kinds of audiences. So we're in the process of completing projects related to the theme of, quote, restoring place as a result of cultural diversity. We're working with the award-winning St. John's-based radio documentarian Chris Brooks to develop a phone app that enables users to access the app either as they walk downtown St. John's and some outlying areas, or remotely, as well as an accompanying website that provides more in-depth interviews and in-depth community information. The primary content of the phone app is audio stories and also includes photographs from different time periods, historical facts, and community profiles that help to contextualize those stories.
This broadening of ideas around how communities are comprised is significant and demonstrates an important shift in music research in Canada, one that actively and intentionally connects people through diverse explorations of lived culture and experience. Equally significant is the broadening of temporal concepts of community, evident in Bev's work through various archival projects associated with MMAP. I'm thinking in particular of her assertion, drawing from Staniak and Peacock, that audio recordings present a commingling of past and present, a commingling that results in sometimes unpredictable outcomes. Recordings are not ephemeral, but neither are they static, and as such, the ways that they are engaged and made accessible in the present matters a great deal. So it's not just about making archival recordings available to various publics, but about how they are made available. At a time when digital access to materials is increasingly expected in public institutions and archives, this nuance is meaningful. One tangible early example of the care taken at MMAP to recognize archival recordings as historical actors and to meaningfully engage collections with diverse audiences, including local communities, is the project built around the McEdward Leach collection. Leach did fieldwork in Newfoundland and Cape Breton in 1950, returning to Newfoundland in 1951, and the resultant recording of over 600 songs and stories are housed at Memorial University's Folklore and Language Archive, or MUNFLA. In conversation with community members, both informally and through committees such as the Community Advisory Group and the Executive Committee of MMAP, it became clear early in the center's existence that access to MUNFLA's audio collections was important to members of the local community. The McEdward Leach and the Songs of Atlantic Canada website was one of several responses to this interest. The site is a digital archive, but though it serves to make archival recordings, texts, and transcriptions available, it also provides extensive additional contextual information that makes its content accessible to a diverse body of users, regardless of the knowledge that they bring or don't bring to the site. For example, a history and review of the collection clarifies details about Leach's fieldwork in Atlantic Canada. A biography of McEdward Leach contextualizes the collection within his life and work. An essay framing collecting in Newfoundland more broadly provides yet another point of entry. Singer biographies and information about specific communities are included wherever available. Songs can be searched in multiple ways, by title, genre, theme, etc. And community members are invited to contribute their own local knowledge to enrich the website. This last point is significant as it challenges some common assumptions about authority. As Bev described it in 2007, quote, "In retrospect, I see that our archival site links interlocal communities of interest and generates competing narratives or even potentially fictive interpretations. I argue then that the social technologies of websites devoted to contemporary cultures may have relevance for this study of an archival internet project." She goes on, "What are the implications if we accept the impossibility of a final text, a final authority? Will it be moral chaos, scholarly mayhem, deeper understanding, or a little of each? We shall have to be vigilant," end quote. And the Center has been and continues to be vigilant. In fact, a revised and updated version of the McEdward Leach website, affectionately referred to as Leach 2.0, is currently underway. In addition to updating the website's look and functionality, it has been more than a decade since the site went live, the new project will contain an updated biographical essay, updated song notes, full versions of songs, and playlists developed by interdisciplinary scholars and practitioners to enable varied entry points into and deeper engagement with the collection. That this 2.0 project is possible and needed underscores the impact of the original initiative as a valuable means of engaging diverse audiences.
Collaboration takes many forms, and MMAP's projects have been shaped over the past 14 years by Bev's vision for meaningful university-community collaborations, a broad recognition of legal and moral copyright, and projects that would, as she has written, quote, "stimulate crosstalk between academics, artists, and audience by challenging some of the prevailing narratives around Newfoundland and Labrador culture," end quote. Since 2004, MMAP has produced 8 CDs under Bev's leadership, with 1 more in production. While the CDs began as research center initiatives, several CDs have since been initiated by community organizations or individuals who have approached MMAP regarding collaboration. 6 CDs in the series focus on Newfoundland and Labrador's Indigenous and settler traditions, while Bellows and Bows, or Soufflet et Hachet, a collection of historical fiddle and accordion recordings from across Canada, is national in scope. Most CDs were guest produced by a scholar with particular expertise, and Bellows and Bows involved a team of area experts. The series is committed to producing photo-rich and historically detailed booklets, ranging from 40 to 160 pages, that exceed the normal standards of documentation in CD liner notes. Notably, culture bearers and their stories are given special attention. Whereas earlier projects such as the Leach website involved single-source copyright, the CD series is a commercial enterprise with legal implications, as well as sales that generate a modest amount of revenue to support subsequent research center projects. Each project has offered unique challenges with regard to copyright, and arrangements for the revenue has varied. In all cases, MMAP pays a fee to singers and musicians, or their descendants, for the use of individual tracks from archival or rare or out-of-print commercial sources, as well as the legal copyright holders for where we could find them. Some people do crosswords, but I often joke that MMAP researchers scroll the obituaries. In this way, as Bev has described it, quote, "we wish to extend the principles of copyright to oral tradition bearers in addition to the collectors who had fixed and hence legally owned the recordings," end quote. In a few instances where projects had been initiated by community members or where they were more directly involved, or in one instance where the legal copyright holders are unknown and local practice dictates a broad distribution of revenue, other revenue sharing arrangements have been agreed upon. This approach to copyright and revenue sharing has many challenges, the time involved in locating performers or their families, for instance, but it's proven to offer many benefits. In the course of contacting families for permission for use of tracks, which often involved conversations with numerous people before landing on the person sought, including one memorable day when I cold called every snow in Newfoundland, We were able to verify our research, and as a result, gather rich layers of documentation, additional photographs and written material, and a wealth of other information. The commingling of past and present that Judith referred to earlier is exemplified in the bringing together of past and present voices on most of the CDs in the Back on Track series. This took form in some instances by engineering a musical arrangement involving archival audio and newly recorded material, such as pitch matching traditional ballad singer Robert Child with contemporary singer-songwriter Pamela Morgan, complemented by a newly recorded accordion accompaniment. Or, more radically, layering Gordon Kendall's ballad with electronic sounds, audio samples, and rap-style lyric delivery. Old and new sources are juxtaposed on most of the CDs by commissioning new performances of archival material. As Bev reflects, quote, "What does it mean on Bellows and Bows that fiddlers from an earlier generation who are no longer living sit next to the newest compositions of an Inuk in Nunavut, or that back rooms of fiddle contests and parlor performances sit side by side with studio-made tracks? What does it mean that on Weldak, that a traditional Mi'kmaq Kojua dance could be adapted as a fiddle tune? The past is always linked into the present, but our reflection on the co-laboring of living and dead is particularly apt for understanding the potential impact of proactive archival reissues. The practices described here surrounding MMAP's archival projects and broad recognition of intellectual property in particular offer ways of thinking to the future of community collaborations and engagement for the future. The two-way nature of Bev's, and by extension numerous other scholars' work through the center, illustrates the potential for scholars to positively impact public opportunities and needs, and the potential for our work to be enriched through collaborations that exemplify mutual respect, mutual contributions, and mutual benefits for all participants. We'd like to open the floor to discussion about future directions and best practices for community engagement, and we'd be particularly interested to hear about projects that you or other colleagues have undertaken and any insights they might shed on this particular topic.
Yes, Heather.
I'll ask a question. Sorry, I just had a good conversation with somebody else about using archival work and making it publicly available, and the issues of copyright and the issues of royalty payments. And so at the Beaton Institute at Cape Breton University, when we're using historical documentation, and Judith and I have worked on a project on this with dance recently, the attitude from the Beaton Institute has been really that because it's not, the materials aren't likely to create tension in being shared, they're not personal details that might be embarrassing, that the general tendency has been to share that material and then have a takedown policy, so that if the material, if anybody says, you know, I really don't want you to use that, then it comes down, rather than to seek the permission first and then try to use that. And I'm just curious, is that something that, and I don't know whether Bev wants to talk to about this or whether anybody on the panel wants to speak about this, was that a thought, a process that you had debated using, and if so, why did you choose not to do that, or what are some of, because I have to say that the idea of going to find every single person next of kin who might be potentially involved with something is an incredible undertaking. So I'm just curious of what was the thinking process there and choices made.
You know what, I'm sorry, but we really need you to use the microphone because we're videotaping this.
Perfect. I will.
Take it out.
Yeah, if you could summarize.
Sure. So the question was around sort of MF's practice around finding the sources of legal copyright in particular.
And permissions.
What's that?
And permissions.
And getting permissions
Right.
for use of the material. For our CD projects, we have done sort of our best effort to find both legal and we call it moral copyright holders for the material. I believe, if you could correct me, I think we found the legal copyright holders in all cases for the material that's on there. In a few cases, we weren't able to find all the moral copyright holders. I think maybe one example for a couple of the CDs. The Leach collection began before my time at MMAT, but I know that in that case they did not seek out all the copyright holders for all the tracks. That's right. But there is a very clear note that similar to the Beaton Institute's policy that if they that tracks will be taken down if family comes forward and doesn't want something on there. I don't think that's ever been the case. So, I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything to that. It certainly is. You know, it's not an easy process to find all the copyright holders and get all the permissions. But I think at MMAP we've agreed that it really made the projects much richer for taking that extra time to do that. And we really have been able to gain an incredible amount of additional information and just great stories and connections to community members. In some ways, I mean, distribution is also an issue, getting the CDs out, and by making all these connections through the community, that helps with that process as well.
Yes.
Me.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm gonna get you a mic.
Here, there's plenty up here.
May I ask a structural question while you're doing that, Mariana?
Yeah, go ahead.
I actually have a question for Bev, but is that not appropriate at this point? Would you rather not talk?
Depends on the question.
It's okay if I call you Bev. My name's Kay. Oh, good, perfect. So I can just hand it over to her. I'm going to try to do this quickly, and that is disciplinarily, what you have done is very different from what I've done. I have worked on United States sacred music, and I've tried very hard to resist in this presentation the temptation to say, oh, what they're talking about is a lot like what I've talked about, because I don't think that's true. I think that there may be some very vague similarities, but for the most part, you're talking about a very different corpus of work than I have used. But I'm remaking my gender class, and Bev Diamond is going to be on the syllabus. And here's my question, a summative question. In a situation like this, you all did a brilliant job of creating a synthesis of a career to date that's very active, and she has tons of plans. And I'd like to know if in your career to date, you think that way. I understood from the presentation that at the ground of much of what you've done is what it all means. What your field work means to the people that you do it for, how does gender impact what has happened, what does it, so I wonder if that's anywhere near a true statement, or if that's just a reflection of what's happened in the panel. As you are going through the work that you've done in a couple of decades or maybe more, has your goal always been to make a synthesis, or is that something that happened at the end? Do you feel like even talking about that?
I'll say two things.
First, I'll say that I trust my life to any one of the people on the panel at the front of the room. They're all magnificent. I think the only thing I'll say in response to you is that I think it's a grand conversation. If scholarship is part of a bigger enterprise of social interaction that helps us grapple with history, but also with contemporary life and with the imagining of futures. And the grand conversation is what we need for that. So whatever form that takes, however that goes, it can be helpful at the best of times. Or it can be terribly agonistic and seemingly at an impasse. It's not all friendly, of course, but that's still helpful. So it's a grand conversation.
Thank you.
So I think we're going to continue with the roundtable. We do have a little bit more to contribute, and the next person speaking is me again. So the last prepared section of the roundtable is titled The Ongoing Impacts of Beverley Diamond's Work in Academia. And I want to apologize or just explain that Dylan Robinson was unable to come. So my talk has been a bit also about Bev's role as a mentor, because that is who she is for many of us. So, as you can probably tell by now, her impact, Bev's impact in so many domains has been immense. She has generated required readings in the areas of narratives and discourses about Canadian music, Indigenous music studies, gender issues, media. In most of these areas, you can't teach a course without invoking Bev in her work. Indeed, as Canada celebrates 150 years since Confederation, we are reminded of the important questioning of what counts as Canadian music, whose voices are silenced or marginalized, gender equity and women's rights, the shifts in public awareness of and attitudes towards the Indigenous peoples on this land. This questioning has been central to Bev's approach to research and teaching and has shaped the ways that we, as scholars, engage with tradition bearers, musicians, and each other. We have learned that we cannot accept the status quo, that we need to disrupt unarticulated assumptions about privilege, class, and gender, but that the questioning can be done in a nurturing and productive way. And move up to the next page. In Indigenous music studies, we have been taught to reflect deeply on our roles as Indigenous peoples or as ally settlers, and that we need to be sensitive to the relationships that bind us and which can also lead to our undoing. Respect is central to the work that is done, but Bev never lectured about that core value of ethnographic research, rather she modeled it. The relational basis of the work that we do as ethnomusicologists with one another and those around us is most evident in her interactions with us as scholars. Bev has been a profound mentor to scholars and scholarship throughout Canada, the United States, and internationally. While this roundtable is comprised of Canadian colleagues, I and others here can attest to the influence and support she has given to scholars around the world. As someone whose research follows in some of the same areas as Bev's, I've had the luxury of seeing her impact in smaller, more specialized meetings, for example, the Music and Gender Study Group of the International Council for Traditional Music, as well as the the Indigenous Music section of the Society for Ethnomusicology. These are just two examples. In these smaller gatherings and symposia, Bev is regarded as a mentor to colleagues who weren't official students in the programs in which she taught. While her publications have been impactful in these areas, equally important is the network of scholars that revolve around Bev. Whether it is the research about systemic gender biases in music institutions in Europe by Anna Hoffman in Slovenia, or intercultural music making by Haudenosaunee cellist and scholar Don Avery in the United States, Bev generates a sense of empowerment in those around her, offering constructive feedback and support, while fostering a community of peers who learn from and support one another. I now want to shift attention back to Bev's role as mentor, not that I ever stopped talking about that, and how her leadership style fits into the classroom. In preparation for today's talk, I reached out to some of my colleagues who likewise studied with Bev, and I reviewed the materials that were generated as part of the festival for Bev back in 2010. A few key terms stand out for me. Bev is humble, diplomatic, not condescending, empowering, questioning, but positive. She's never going in for the kill. She's pragmatic, she's productive, she's ethical, and she's fair. She believes in facilitating creativity, getting us to think outside of our comfort zone, creating safe spaces for the development of ideas. She believes in encouraging questions, different perspectives, recognizing strengths, willingness to take risks. She believes in listening rather than speaking in order to gain knowledge and wisdom, and never speaking to simply hear one's own voice. She also offered reflections and tips as a female academic in what has been a male-dominated discipline. Although Bev emphasized that this roundtable should not be about her, but about ideas of future directions in ethnomusicology and the study of music in Canada, I believe one of her greatest accomplishments is in shaping our approaches to academia more broadly and fostering a community of scholars built on respect, reciprocity, and goodwill. What would Bev do? Many of us use these 4 words as a workplace adage when we find ourselves making decisions. As many of us have seen in her careful negotiation of the workplace, field research, and interaction with those around her, we strive to model that generous spirit in our own interactions. To close, I want to share some words that were shared by Virginia Caputo, who is here. She decided to come today. So there were a few email exchanges, And I just felt there was an exchange between Virginia, Kip, and I. They were the two students who kind of led the rest of us in generating some responses around the Feshra for Bev. So I wanted to quote her, even though she's here, she could speak these words herself. So these exchanges reminded me of how much Bev means to us. As I move further along this path of academia, I appreciate more and more how influential it was to have experienced as a graduate student Bev's integrity of scholarly approach, and to watch how she managed the challenges of an academic environment, and of course, to feel the warmth and collegiality that she extended to her students, something I think about quite often as the academic environment around me shifts and changes. I'm sure many others could contribute more to this discussion, and I look forward to hearing more anecdotes and reflections throughout the weekend. And now I want to turn it over to Ellen Waterman, and she's going to comment on, further extend this discussion around Bev's impact in academia. But I'll give you her bio first. Ellen Waterman is a professor of ethnomusicology at Memorial University of Newfoundland, where she is currently graduate officer for ethnomusicology. She is also the Memorial Site Coordinator of the International Institute for Critical Studies in Improvisation. So, Ellen.
Okay, so the first thing I want to say about Bev Diamond is she's not done yet. This is a long career, and Bev's is longer than some because she started when she was about 12, as far as I can tell. And so there's a great energy behind the work that she's doing now as a professor emerita. I'm sitting with her on our School of Music's indigenization committee, for example, right now. So she's just never saying no to meaningful work. And we really, really appreciate the fact that she remains so engaged in our graduate program. I also want to explain what the Canada Research Chair program is briefly for those of you who aren't from Canada. This is Canada's largest externally funded chairs program. It's a government program. And the hiring process is extensive. You have to hunt for the license to hunt for a CRC within your institution because you only get so many. Then you have to hunt for the level that you're allowed to apply for. Bev was the only Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in ethnomusicology in Canada during her tenure, and that was renewed. And then you have to hire an appropriately internationally significant person, and then after your university has hired that person, it goes back to a government committee that then sends it out for additional peer review and to make sure that the candidate is vetted and is worthy of this Canada Research Chair. One of the most generous things that Bev did was kind of planning to step down from her role at the MF was to spend 2 years helping me and others to find her replacement. So I want to talk a little bit about the opportunity that the Canada Research Chairs program provides, because it really speaks to an attitude towards curriculum development that I think points to some of the really hot button issues that we're all facing in the academy today, and helps us look forward to the kinds of moves we need to be thinking about in ethnomusicology, in fact, music humanities study in general. So first of all, in coming to Memorial, she developed the idea of creating this research center for music, media, and place, and then integrated that thoroughly into the development of graduate programs at the MA and PhD level in ethnomusicology in our school. And I want to really shout out to Kati Zego, because all of this work, as Bev would be the first to say, was done very much in tandem. I'm really lucky to work in that program, I feel. So the ethnomusicology graduate programs were developed in the mid-2000s, and they were developed in ways that integrated the life of the research center with the training of students. So they're interdisciplinary. They draw on strengths at the School of Music and at the existing large Department of Folklore with its very impressive archive, the monthly archive that's been discussed already. The courses are thematic rather than based in area studies. And they cut across particular fields to get to large issues at stake in those fields. the intersectionality of race, gender, class, sexuality, ability, disability, rural and urban environments, immigration, interculturalism, indigeneity, and the mediation of all of those issues in our contemporary societies. It also has a strength in experiential training in both video and radio documentary with staff at the MMAP who are experts in these areas and equipment for students to use. So we tend to get students who want an interdisciplinary environment and who are looking to develop an intellectual sensibility to do particular kinds of work. And that ends up happening across an astonishing and sometimes quite difficult from a supervisory point of view, range of fields in terms of field studies. Students are integrated into the community engaged projects at the MMAP, as both Megan and Judith described. The effect is modeling an ethics of community engagement and reciprocity in fieldwork throughout graduate student training. We don't have an applied ethnomusicology course, but the applied nature of ethnomusicology is modeled throughout everything that we do. Bev's approach to curriculum is ethical, pragmatic, and creative. In the parlance of current scholarship on teaching and learning, we might call it learner-centered, but in a particularly outward-looking manner. She encourages students to work from their experience, but to do so in order to think about the problems in our field and in the world, and to consider ways that they might address those problems through their work. She offers a simple formula for her students. I don't mean this to be simplistic, but more in the sense of something that I feel like I can carry with me into the classroom or into supervision. What is your experience? So what? What does it mean to you and to the content that you're dealing with? And then the big question, does it really matter? How does it matter? How does this work in the world? I think that Bev's approach to curriculum building at Memorial, I wasn't there when the graduate programs were first developed, but I was there when we went through a full-scale, all-involved School of Music curriculum review in 2011 and 12. And I watched firsthand the effectiveness of her diplomatic hard-nosedness. That's a hard trick to pull off, to be flexible and diplomatic, but to by no means be wussy. There is nothing wussy about Bev Diamond. that kind of will to collaboration and will to collegiality, but with a firm bedrock of belief in what she wants to see get done. This is the kinds of moves that inspire me as I think about my next 10, 15, 20 years in the academy. So I want to offer two big challenges in the academy that I think we're facing, and to use them, I guess, as provocations for further discussion. The first is relevance. We're all involved in discussions of relevance of our curricula to students, to the challenges and opportunities in contemporary society, and to the large issues that shape our world, the environment, the movement of people across borders, diversity, social justice. These are not new issues by any means, but we all know that we just seem to be barreling forward into ever more fraught circumstances for all of these issues. I think we need to speak back to the attack on the humanities that is all too often happening within our institutions. By no means a new problem either, but one that seems to be worsening. And we need to do so in a way that respects the aims and ambitions of our colleagues in other areas of music, such as the applied area. It's more important than ever that we work strategically, collaboratively, and creatively to design curricula that will really serve and prepare our students to make their own distinctive contributions to scholarship and to society. And we need to resist being simply reactive. Curricula should be grounded in genuine intellectual, social, and aesthetic issues and materials, not simply in response to whatever the current institutional or governmental or media emphasis is, or where the money is perceived to be. In Newfoundland, we're approaching a critical mass of engineering students where we might end up actually having nothing but engineers in our province. inspired by a comment that Dana Bates wrote about Bev's balanced approach to the field. Writing about her approach to theorizing music and gender in the Festschrift that has been mentioned, Bates wrote, "When Bev was completing her musicological training in Toronto in the 1970s, many scholars were advancing an essentialist viewpoint. Gender was widely understood as an inherent quality that men and women could express or represent. Masculinity and femininity were often grounded in biology, giving them a supposed fixed and material basis. Bev's work never adhered strictly to this perspective, despite the currency it had in her formative years. Instead, she recognized that gender could be influenced by social factors. Later, when constructionism eventually displaced essentialism as a widely preferred account of gender, Bev's work retained its independence, its balance. Rather than understanding gender as a thoroughly fragmented and ephemeral product of cultural processes, she points to cohesive senses of gender identity and recognizes experience and subjectivity as vital sources of knowledge." Close quote. And what inspires me here is Bates' account of an intellectual position, developed and refined over years, aware of and responsive to new developments, but grounded in a core commitment to situated and experiential knowledges. It's a grounded approach that, in my view, translates across wider program and curriculum development. We need to ask ourselves, why do we really need PhD-trained people? Because we live in a world with enormous challenges, and we need to create space and time for intelligent and ambitious young people to develop and articulate their core intellectual values, and to learn to design and implement complex projects. In my experience, more and more PhD students are looking for ways to have an impact on their communities, to use ethnomusicology as a vehicle for tackling large real-world problems. We need to reconceptualize the PhD program as the incubation lab for such instincts to flourish. I think Bev's invocation of the grand conversation is really nice in that way. A correlative issue to the idea of relevance is preparing graduate students to work in a significantly altered academy and in the public sector. Those of us who work in graduate programs are familiar with institutional pressures to increase PhD enrollments, even as job opportunities for PhDs in the academy diminish. PhD students are seen as research-intensive students who bring external grant dollars and prestige to our institutions. In my institution, it has very frankly been talked about as improving our Maclean's magazine rankings, which has to be about the crassest reason to do anything I can imagine. We have watched the struggles of brilliant and accomplished graduates to win postdoctoral fellowships, term positions, and interview for a diminishing number of tenure-stream jobs. I was chatting with some colleagues of correlative age today, and we admitted to one another that we might not actually be able to get a job in today's market if we were just starting out at the level that we were when we graduated from our doctorates. So the conversation about public sector work in ethnomusicology, of course, has been going on for several years now. And I want to suggest that we should be fostering an attitude of openness and respect for the wider range of jobs that benefit from PhD-prepared students. Highly organized, independent researchers, excellent writers, creative thinkers. This roundtable includes great examples of scholars who are working in museum curation and research center leadership. Some of Bev's former students have also made significant careers in arts management and in the entrepreneurial, creative realm of music. Such PhDs are everywhere, but have we properly acknowledged the benefits that their education brings to their work in the world? My inspiration here is the attitude of possibility, openness to new directions, and deep respect for cultural workers of all kinds that Bev has brought to Memorial University. The MMAP has modeled this attitude in its core organization, with an executive board made up of tradition bearers and community arts workers, as well as academics. The public sector must not be the job you take if you can't get an academic position. It ought never to be the fallback position. Indeed, it is possible that in the future, the public sector job may in fact be more secure and more lucrative than the university job. We need to inform students about such possibilities, help them to acquire the relevant skills and experience to be competitive for good public sector jobs. But we also need to foster a culture of respect for this wider field of possibilities. The challenge for those of us with what my husband likes to call that comfortable tenure-track position is not simply to set out to create students in our own image. There's a lot we need to learn about public sector jobs and the new academy. Beth's legendary ability to create room for her students to find their own way, to discover their potential, to work outwards from their experience, to challenge students to tackle real-world problems, to me, offers a great model for learning how to be in the professoriate today. Thanks.
So we have about 35 minutes where we can have a discussion amongst everybody here. If there are reflections from those of you who are on the other side of the table, we welcome those. Maybe we can start with that, if there's anybody who'd like to say something. I'll leave a really uncomfortable pause. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. I really enjoyed all your presentations. I was a grad student of Bev's from the late 1980s, and it was, of course, as many would agree here who studied with Bev, it was a significant turning point. Dr. Phil says that there are 5 people, I know, syndicated speaker Dr. Phil says that there are usually 5 people who write on the slate of who you are, and Bev Diamond wrote on the slate of who I was. But 2 other quick comments. One is just one of those turning points, one of those penny dropping moments with Bev. It was early in the PhD program at York University, and there was a very small group in the first year PhD class. And we were at Bev's house for one of the classes, and one of the students felt that she was feeling quite privileged within the class. She was a more mature student. She spoke, she had a very strong Christian faith, and she really felt marginalized because the other people in the class all came from much more marginalized positions. You know, whether that be more queer or in some way more marginalized. And this student said to all of us, I'm very frustrated because I feel, she really spoke in many ways, she was really feeling the weight of her hegemonic privilege. And she said, I really feel like do I always have to speak from this position? And there was silence, and Bev said, you don't always have to speak from that position, but you can never speak without it. And that's one of those moments that I use every year in my classes. As you know, between myself and my students, we're always trying to situate our own place within the research and how we can both value our position within it, but also see it as being just one small part of the work and how to bring it in. The second point is that many people here know that Bev is a significant doodler. And we really should have, for those of you who've seen the Bev's Festschrift, there are beautiful doodles. And I've thought a lot about the doodling over the years and watching her in class, but of course, what I wasn't understanding at the time is that as Bev doodled, she was listening. And this is all part of it. And to think, and sometimes I'll evoke the image of just doodle when a student is saying something I can't quite believe they're saying, right? But to just sit back and breathe and just take in that space. She allowed such tremendous space for us in the classes. And sometimes I look at the doodle at the end of the class and you can see the beauty of what was happening within her mind while we were having a chance to speak. So, thank you, Beth.
Thank you, Kip. We do have a couple questions we'd like to throw out for general discussion, because like I've said throughout this roundtable, Bev did not want this to be about her, but about ideas. And I know working with her through the Center or the Canadian Society for Traditional Music, a lot of the work that she does is about getting stuff done, and not just think about ideas, but projects, and what might we move forward. And I guess some questions for us to think about moving forward. We've had this great celebration of a scholar who's impacted so many people in so many different ways. So moving forward, I guess the question that we'd like to pose, and everybody is welcome to respond to this, is what should we think about now? What are the future directions of ethnomusicology, the study of music in Canada and beyond? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? What are pressing issues that we should be engaging with as a Society for American Music, Society for Ethnomusicology, Canadian Music Scholarship, music scholars today? What matters? What can we do? What should we do? What might we do? You look, Virginia.
Well, as this is the Society for American Music meeting, I'll take up that question and answer it. One pressing need that I feel in my teaching responsibilities at the University of Toronto every year is to place music in Canada in a North American perspective. There is no textbook on music in North America. Bev has addressed this issue in several of her articles about the need to understand what we're doing, not locally or nationally, but continentally at the very least. And so I teach this course in music in North America every year, and I'm trying to find ways of making it relevant to the student's experience and trying to understand how making useful comparisons between musical experiences in Canada and musical experiences in the United States can enrich a student's understanding of music in general. So what I have tended to do in that class is to compare one Canadian musician with a similar American musician and understand how their career has unfolded differently according to their nationality. So I would take Gord Lightfoot and Bob Dylan, for instance, and say, why did Gord Lightfoot become Gord Lightfoot and Bob Dylan become Bob Dylan? What were the experiences and the potential for developing their career that were evident in their situatedness either in Canada or the United States, or their border crossings, how did that influence them, and what was the nature of the border crossings according to where their point of departure was. So I would like to see more North American music studies, and the Society for American Music is obviously a great place for that kind of scholarship to be happening.
Bev, you are welcome to comment at any point. Kip.
I'll be brief. Just thinking about the U.S. elections, since we are the Society for American Music, I think we also need to address what's happening politically right now, and it's certainly not a place for Canadians to be able to sit back and relax and be at all smug, because people like Kevin O'Leary and Kelly Leach are also working very hard to be able to take over the leadership of this country. But even this morning I was reading an article, I think it was in the Huffington Post, about travel bans for musicians crossing over and coming into the United States, and I think how that's going to impact musically. So I just want to put a shout out to everyone to become, think about more activist ways in which we can approach politics, to be able to take a stand against what's happening, and what we can do with the music and beyond music to be able to address these unfortunate days. Not so sunny ways for those of you who know that.
I have a colleague that says, we're going to have to answer your question, Kip, we're going to have to take to the streets again. He really believes that we ended the United States involvement in Vietnam by taking to the streets. So yeah, this is something that we're all incredibly concerned about, and especially the way our country is being viewed across the world, and especially by our good friends. So that's one answer. Seriously, this gentleman, just a little bit older than I, and so he demonstrated in the 60s. I started demonstrating in the 70s. And we thought we had it handled. And clearly it's cyclic, so we don't. And so we're open. One last thing, because Bev was talking about privilege in the 1980s, and we're woefully behind in that conversation in the United States. we need to sit and learn the way we are today, and find models and people like that.
Yeah, just on activism, for people who haven't seen the postcard campaign yet, down by the conference registration, and if you're not an American citizen, pick a Republican or in Hatch, for example. I'm sure he'd love to hear from you. Right? Seriously, I mean, you know, so please write a postcard. The postage is paid, the addresses are there, drop it in there. There weren't very many this morning when I wrote mine, so please spread the word about that.
They're mailing them every day.
Oh, they're mailing them every day, okay, good.
So he's like a team of speakers.
So I am at a primarily undergraduate institution. So for me, I think it's obviously very important that we think about graduate education, but for me, I'm primarily involved with undergraduate education. And the kinds of issues that I'm struggling with where I am, and thinking about the lessons that are being evoked here today, the lessons that we need to help students to start from their experiences, that we are not limited to the local or to the national, and that we find ways to help our students to look beyond academia as the end point of an education, and that applied projects have incredible value. The thing I'm struggling with is what do we do with the undergraduate classroom to get them out of the classroom? I think graduate programs are designed to make that much easier in terms of the size of the classes, the way that they're organized in the timetable, the number of courses that students take, the room that's there for field work or for graduate, for their actual research. Undergraduate students are incredibly timetabled. They're very full schedules, and often increasingly now students have to work in order to subsidize their education. How do we find ways to get the students out of the classroom and working in community so that those become their experiences that they can then build from and bring back to the classroom, and think about how that connects with some of the theories that we've been talking about today. So that's the maybe the sort of future issue that I'm interested in exploring further as I move ahead in my career.
I too teach undergraduates at a business college, so it's even worse because the last thing they're going to devote their free time to is community engagement for music, although they'll do it for business. But one thing I'm thinking of is just getting them to think much more critically. Like I teach global pop, for example. And so all the orientalizing that goes on in pop music, whether it's somebody from outside the United States or within the United States who's just sort of glomming on to a marginalized music in some way to add, color. I'm finding that they're absolutely outraged when they start thinking about this, which makes me so happy. But they don't even listen to words in English, let alone, anything else. So, I mean, to me, I think that these kinds of things that open up their minds to appropriation and to taking advantage and intellectual ownership and song ownership and oral cultures and all of this, for my population, this is completely new to them, and I love seeing how angry they are because they're going out and to become business people, and they will have economic power, in the world, and they might be the people who are working for Coca-Cola deciding who the next Kanon is for the World Cup. So, that's something I think, for those of us who teach undergrads, that we can have an immediate impact on.
I'd also like to comment on that, Heather. I have the privilege of teaching in a larger city. It's not a huge city. And in the undergraduate courses that I teach, I tend to design assignments where students have to go to a live music concert of a world music, for lack of a better term, concert. So in my world music class, they choose the culture, they do some background research, learn about the culture, go to a concert and have that live experience. And this term I'm just finishing teaching a course It's a 4th, 5th year course, Ethnomusicology of Canadian Traditions, and the project was, let's learn about the non kind of hegemonic, not French, not British cultures. And so they chose what they wanted to research, and they went out and they interviewed musicians. They went to workshops and presentations and concerts. So I think in terms of sending students into the community is waiting, like the community is willing and interested in hearing from students. So I think it's also a curricular challenge that, you have to set up the ethics, protocols ahead of time so they can go and interview people. But I think there's, within larger cities, and I know Sydney is not the same as Ottawa, but there are opportunities, even just if it's a more limited cultural diversity in your city, go listen to these musicians, listen to what they're saying and talking to them. I think that's a way of getting them out of the classroom, because I can be a talking head and I can talk a lot, but until they go talk to musicians, and at the end of these projects, right now it's all the student presentations, and they've come away totally enriched, totally empowered, and they're like committed to learn more. And again, because I am privileged in that I teach in a program where Canadian music is valued, I teach a number of courses. It's a required component of the program, thanks to the work of Elaine Keeler. They have to take a Canadian music course. And that allows me the privilege of unpacking these things that we've been talking about. Again, I see Bev as, you don't teach Canadian music without questioning the narratives and questioning the white privilege, the privilege of the French and the British, and what about all the Indigenous peoples? And so I think it's, everyone is in a different situation or a different kind of place in terms of geographic locations, but I do see, by questioning these narratives, I mean, students come away from this class, this one student's like, I didn't understand my white privilege. I didn't get it. I didn't know what hegemony was. And to raise those questions in a course where students come in, a lot of students in music programs, they want to whack away on their guitar. They want to pound their drums. They want to make music. They don't want to engage critically. But by questioning these things and allowing them to reflect on them and go into the community and see, you can interact. Let's talk about music making. I think that's a way that we can actually, unpack the institution a little bit for them or send them out. But I know other people do a lot of really great teaching here and community work.
Like you, Heather, of course, we're a bit geographically isolated. Memorial University is in Newfoundland, which is at the eastern tip of the island, and it is the center of the universe, actually. But it is small, and we really need to bring folks in if we want to provide a wide range of experiences for our students. One of the things that has struck me recently is sitting on this indigenization committee with Kadi and Bev and some other colleagues. The first thing Kadi said was, we can't have this committee be just all the ethnomusicologists in the program. We need to expand this committee so that it includes all of our colleagues from the different areas of the school. And then Bev very cleverly said, well, actually, it needs to be our Indigenous colleagues who are working in the university, and we have to reach out to our far-flung campuses in Labrador and on the west coast of Newfoundland. That attitude of inclusiveness, of discussion, and also of strategically getting on board with something that the university cares about at the moment. I talked about not being reactive, but there is a strategic thing about finding a way in to do the thing you want to do by building on what you hope is a good impulse of your institution in a timely way. So what we're talking about, our dean is excited about the idea of bringing in people to work with our faculty and our students for longish periods of time, anywhere from a week to a month or 2 months over the next couple of years. And the model there was something that Bev brought to us of creating exciting experiences where you live, inside that school of music, that hermetically sealed building that the students spend all their time in, that can then seed that change and that awareness and awakening. And I think that we have to be careful not to create an us and them between ourselves and our students, because I think we need it too, right? And if we want our colleagues to similarly be excited about changes in the academy, we can't adopt an us and them mentality to them either. We all have to find ways to create meaningful experiences together. It's a really, really hard thing to navigate, for sure.
I have a question, if I may. This is taking us in a little different direction. I hope you don't mind. But I have a question for Judith and Megan. I was really interested in your collection, in your digital archive, if you will. I assume that's kind of what it is. And all the cultural artifacts that you have in there and all the music. And I'm wondering if you have any educational resources built in there for educators, for either secondary or primary educators, or if you address that. For some of these CDs, we have put together, we consulted with some of our music education colleagues, and we did put together kind of teaching guides to accompany a couple of the CDs, and it was something that Bev and I talked quite a lot about, and we did put it together for two. But it's something I'd like to see happen for all of them. I think it makes them more relevant, more useful for teachers. Some of the CDs have been purchased by different school boards across Canada. Bells and Bows, for example, nationwide. The Well-Doc CD, the Folklore Sampler CD is used by a few university classes in Newfoundland. So it's something that I think would be useful to do for all of them. We haven't done that for the Leach website or the others, just for the CDs.
Just regarding the Leach website, I was a grad student when that was being developed, and I wasn't on the core team, but I did do a lot of transcribing of melodies, and I think that was also intentionally done to recognize that while these are oral traditions to a large extent, there are those who will come to it without any prior experience, and so it's useful to have a visual reference point when listening for certain types of people who are engaging. So it's not an educational program per se, but it's also recognizing the different ways that people will approach the material.
My then grade 5 daughter used the McLeach website to create her heritage project for school, so it's really friendly.
That's great.
We have time for more questions or discussion. I mean, I would love to turn this, and this would be an unfair thing to do, but I'm going to throw it out there. I'd like to hear what Bev thinks in terms of where things are going in the future and what should our priorities be. But we can save that for a dinner time conversation if she doesn't want to talk now.
So I will just, we don't need to record me, but I will just throw out that we have a reception which is actually kind of ready now.
Oh.
And then we can come back and do the ceremony at 5:30.
Oh, wonderful.
The honorary member ceremony is scheduled for 5:30.
And is that in this room?
It's in here.
Awesome.
Right. So if we want, we can go and have a glass of wine, a little cheese and crackers, and then come back at 5:30. Or we can stay here and talk some more.
No, I think in the end, I think everyone has. I think at this point, everyone has a really good appreciation of the impact that Bev has had on all of us. So let's carry on the conversation informally.
Perfect.
The ceremony. It says a different room for the ceremony.
What does it say?
Beaker A.
Oh, that's
right across.
that's right across.
It's right here.
Oh, and actually, that's where the reception is. So we'll just go there and see what happens.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Can I just thank Anna for all the work she
Oh my
did
God,
organizing
absolutely.
this? And also, of course, from all of us, Bev, who gave significant bits of her time to help us prepare and kept saying, "Don't make this about me." It's a very Tom Sawyer-ish experience, isn't it, coming to this event?
West over oh my God. I know, it's just, I mean, the people who are so part about how ignorant things don't, they just, like, maybe Fox News and, you know,